the nice thing about entrepreneurship is it's the one career where failing is actually rewarded. And not just on paper, but also for yourself, because there's an actual learning, which is counterintuitive to how traditional careers work. But only if you take the failing as a learning and you learn from it, and then you learn from it again, and you keep going and you keep going, and you find your way around it.
Cedrik Hoffmann, welcome to the show. You're a SaaS founder of Ameeba, a business that's going after the inefficiencies in the supply chain. Now, before this, you had quite a unique experience. You've done bootstraps, you've done VC-backed. Talking about the VC-backed one, you raised over $160 million. You have also lived in Latin America. You've lived in America, Asia, Europe. You're very well traveled. You've serviced a lot of those markets. It's a pretty incredible story. So let's talk about entrepreneurship. Why did you become an entrepreneur?
It's funny that you asked me, because I was just recently in an interview, and a candidate asked me the same question. I think that looking backwards, it was really an excitement to just do something on my own. So to give you a little bit of background about myself, my career journey. So I'm, born and raised in Germany, in a small town just outside of Frankfurt. Lived in China when I was 16 as a high school exchange student. Came back to Germany, finished my high school there, and then I moved to the UK for the first time to study here at the London School of Economics. Actually, I studied economic history, so nothing business related, and I had a real passion for the subject itself. So I was not really thinking about my career that much. And during the LSE is a very career-oriented university. So you go in, and I still remember on my first day at the LSE, I came in and I saw all these students wearing suits on campus. What's going on here? It was really strange. And then I saw that there was a career fair or something like this, and you had all these different banks pitching to students where they should do their internships. And I'm really hyper competitive, so I went there and tried to wrap my head around it. And somebody told me, hey, yeah, so where do you plan to do your first internships? I don't have a clue. I don't really think about my career that much. No, you need to figure out now already where do you want to apply, because then there's the spring internship and the summer internship, and the pinnacle that you can reach is to get either into McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or something like that. So, okay, then I probably need to get into Goldman Sachs. Finished my university, got into Goldman Sachs, into investment banking. From that onwards, then worked on the trading floor at BNP Paribas as a derivative sales trader. And I think I just went with that flow of the career path, assuming that somehow things will work out. And I never got really happy about it. I think there was this moment at BNP Paribas where I still remember I was sitting at the trading floor quite early on. It was like 2-3 months into my career on the trading floor. And, I was looking at my boss, and I was looking at my boss's boss and some of the very senior traders that have really made it in the bank. And I just told myself and realized I don't want to be like them. This was not what I wanted to achieve. Like this was not inspirational to myself. So I went back home, and I still remember I was already together with my wife, and I was so frustrated. I was so lost. I told her, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And she gave me this one hint, which was really eye-opening. She said, why don't you think about the stuff that you're actually interested in? Because apparently I didn't read about stock markets and commodity derivatives in my free time. And the one thing I was always really curious about and very interested in were stories about entrepreneurship. But not, I think, it's very typical in the startup community where you have startup founders and, they talk about the Steve Jobs or the Elon Musk and all of that. I think this was not the part of entrepreneurship I was really excited about. For me, it was these stories around, in Germany, you have these like hidden champions. So it's like family-owned businesses where somebody at some point invented this crew, and this crew is now, part of every single airplane in the world. And none of us thinks about these things. And it's like so crazy to me that somebody at some point came up inventing that screw that is now impacting our lives. And I think this was really this origination where I said, okay, actually, these are the people that I find very fascinating and I admire their path. So, if I find that inspirational, probably I need to do the same thing. And that was really the origination of me thinking about entrepreneurship.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So how old were you when you had that sort of conversation with your wife and you were thinking, I'm not sure I want to do the sort of career that's been laid out for me. I mean, you're a very intelligent guy. You went to one of the best schools in the world. You had an amazing job. I'm sure it was very well paid. And I think because of my audience maybe used to these stories now, that they probably understand what's coming next, which is you blow it all up and you leave that job. But yeah, how old were you like when you were making
I was young. I was 21, 22. So at the time, my wife was not yet my wife. So I think this makes me sound much older than I was at the time. She was my girlfriend at the time. But now I was quite young. It was 1 year out of university into my career, something like this. And I think it was fairly early on. And I think the one big difference that I've had, compared to, maybe some of my friends or even, previous guests is there's this element where a lot of the people, they say, okay, every Sunday I sit down with somebody and brainstorm, a next future idea and what else could I be building. I was never on that path. For me, it was clear, okay, I want to be an entrepreneur. So I took a step back and thought about, okay, where can I actually do something entrepreneurial? Because I don't know nothing. I know maybe a little bit of Excel and PowerPoint, and that's about it. The one USP that I had at the time was I was fluent in Mandarin Chinese. So for me, it was very naturally to say, okay, if I want to look for an opportunity, if I'm going to hunt an opportunity, it's probably not going to be here in London or in Germany or so. It's going to be in East Asia. So when my wife finished her master's, I said, you know what, I'm going to come with you back to Taiwan. She's from Taiwan originally. And I'm going to start a business without any idea, without any knowledge, not knowing what to do about it. Went to Taiwan and I started printing business cards with my name on. No business name. I didn't have a business at the time. And I literally went to every single trade show I could go to that was going on in Taipei. From robotics trade shows to, I don't know, semiconductors to halal food. And I had no clue about any of that stuff. And I just went there and I went to every single booth, every single company, with my little business cards in my pocket. And I was like, hey, if you need somebody to help you sell your products in the Taiwanese market, let me know. Taiwanese company. If you need somebody to help you sell your goods in the German market, let me know. And I was kind of winging it. And it's so funny because today with Ameeba, we go to a lot of trade shows to exhibit. And you have the same type of people like myself, running around. Somebody comes to me, is like, oh, this is very interesting. You know what? I know somebody in India and I could sell it there. And I always respect that because, it's annoying at the same time. But I was somebody like that. I literally just went in and hustle, just tried to meet as many people as possible to discover an opportunity for myself, as opposed to, thinking and philosophizing, okay, what could I be doing? And maybe there's the next $1 billion idea. For me, it was much more about this proactivity and this action that I wanted to take very early on.
So now, obviously, I guess it's about fulfillment. At this point, it sounds like you're unhappy in your previous role. But did you're married and you're maybe looking at future kids and things like that with your wife at the time. Was there not a conversation around, oh, well, I'm kind of leaving this really well-paid job and at the time to nothing?
I think it's a good question. I think I never viewed life philosophically as such. I think fairly early on, even earlier than that, I set out for myself that life is just an accumulation of experiences and I want to maximize my life for that. And I think there was one very, very traumatic event actually. So I had a stepmom and she died when she was 30, 38, 39. And was roughly around the time when I then also decided to make the jump. And I think it was, witnessing that and this moment, almost like an epiphany where you say, oh my God, actually, we don't have that much time. And I don't want to sit around somewhere just, chasing another big paycheck. And of course, there's this element of security and that you want to make money and want to be secure. But I think there's also another element where you kind of take a step back and think about, okay, A, how much do I actually need to be happy on a financial basis? And B, what is it that I really, truly want to get out of my life? And for me, the process of creation was always very, very important. I still remember when I went into the bank as well. For me, it was very natural from the beginning to criticize everything. It's like, why do we do this process? And I got very frustrated. I still remember at some point I realized I had to do more internal presentations than external presentations. And my job was, I was a sales trader, my job was to sell to corporate clients derivative solutions, right? I was very excited about going out into the market. And then I needed to have approval to go to a customer. To me, this was crazy. I said, no, I'm going to go there. I'm going to close them. I was hungry. I wanted to do something. And I felt so restricted in that environment that I couldn't even do the best, what I think would have been best for the business and the best job. And I think this feeling of being like very constricted and confined in this environment was almost like a jail to me. And I think that that this was something very, very important. This far outweighed the risk of, okay, maybe I'm going to make some money, maybe not. There's always an opportunity to make money. But I think this was something very, very important to myself at the time, and still is, actually.
Amazing. So sort of in that journey, you're running around Taiwan trade shows, giving your card, which just has Cedrik Hoffmann on it, no business. You've not really got an idea or clue what you're doing.
No.
Did it work?
It worked out, but not with a business that wasn't a business. I ended up meeting a lot of people, and I ended up meeting a guy called Jack. And Jack had a factory in Taiwan. Now, Jack was, he's still alive, and we are very close friends by now. But he was sort of like a semi-retiring entrepreneur. So he had this factory, and he didn't really know what to do with it. Son didn't want to take over. He had around 30, 40 employees at the time. And it was just sort of there, serving the same same customers for the last 20 years, something like that. And I met Jack, and he showed me his factory, and we had another meeting and, another meeting. And at some point I went to Jack. I said, Jack, I think there's a massive opportunity. Let me become your business partner, take over this company, and we try to, take TMP, was the name of the company, Taipei Molded Products, and make it the next big Foxconn. And I genuinely believed that I could do that. I think there's always also this element that I've had of how hard can it be, and it's probably, unhealthy overconfidence that has accompanied me my entire life, but it was definitely there. And I proposed this to Jack, and Jack said, you know what, yeah, let's do it. And basically overnight, I became the co-CEO of Taipei Molded Products, this company, knowing nothing about manufacturing. But at least now I had a business that I could work with and, let me wrap my head around manufacturing. So this is really how it then started. Then an entire journey came out of that.
Amazing. So fast forward a couple of years, you started a business called Valoreo.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that just right, but that was based HQ'd in Mexico.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going many miles, east or west, depending on which route you take. How did you end up landing in Mexico?
It was also, and I think this is another part to entrepreneurship. It's this path dependency that you're taking. So I was managing this manufacturing company for close to 4 years. And then the pandemic hit. And it was really, really difficult to navigate this manufacturing company during the pandemic because customers jumped, orders got canceled, all of that. And I think it was an extremely difficult moment for me. And right during the pandemic, I had this moment where I reconnected with some of my old friends from the finance industry that I still had from university. And, there were 3 guys that were working private equity at the time, Blackstone, HG, and Helmut Friedman. And they approached me and they said, hey, Cedrik, we want to start this company in Mexico and, supply chains are very important, but we don't know nothing about it. Can you teach us about supply chains? Like, how do you do the logistics and these different things? And I've learned, obviously, by then a lot about it because I owned a manufacturing company. So I gave them a lot of advice. And, at some point I said, okay, what is this company about? And this was a business model that was very popular at the time of an e-commerce aggregator. So you fundraise a lot of money and you buy up brands that primarily sell on Amazon, on Latin America's Mercado Libre, and then you consolidate these brands, you roll them up, you consolidate them together in like an operational holding. And they were explaining it to me, and I mentioned to these guys, I said, look, you know how to buy a company out of an Excel spreadsheet, but you've never operated them yourselves. You will, this is not going to fly. And they were very smart because they got back to me and said, you know what, we thought about it, you're right. And our solution to the problem is you're going to join us as a co-founder and you manage this supply chain thing. And for me, it was clear, yeah, let's do it. So I moved over to Mexico together with them, and we started Valoreo, the company. And I think at the beginning, when we started Valoreo, we never thought that we would fundraise that much money. So when we raised our seed round, which was a $50 million seed round, one of the largest seed rounds in Latin America, we had a target of maybe 5 million or so. Then there was more interest, and then you had some venture debt as well coming in, and eventually it just became this massive seed round. And from today's perspective, it's so bizarre because you have me, 3 other Germans and the Spanish guy, 5 co-founders. None of us has ever, worked in Latin America or lived there. And now we sit there with $50 million in the bank in Mexico and let's start a company. So, sometimes I say it could have really gone 2 ways. Either I'm in jail now and we have embezzled the money, or we've done what we've done, to actually use it to build a business. But it was a really, really crazy wild ride from that perspective.
Yeah, I can imagine you're sitting on a beach in Mexico with sort of checking that bank balance with a beer in one hand and talking to your fellow co-founders. But you are right. Maybe the stereotypes of that we can move aside.
Yeah.
So how long were you on that journey? and you end up raising, over $150 million.
160 million, yeah. I mean, we raised our seed round shortly after 3-4 months in. We had our Series A of 30 million, and then almost 2 years in, the Series B of 80 million. So 160 million equity and debt together, and we fundraised close to over 2 years in a 2-year horizon. So it was hyper scale. Yeah, we scaled to 230 employees in the peak, expanded from Mexico into Colombia, into Brazil, made many mistakes. It was one of the most brutal learnings I've ever had, because I think there's an element of success in fundraising so much money. But I think from today's perspective, whenever I see founders getting really excited about a fundraising announcement, I'm always a little bit skeptical, because I think fundraisings are almost hailed as a milestone, whereas the milestone should be the business as opposed to the fundraising. The fundraising is just a function to keep the business growing. And I think we definitely made not necessarily the mistake, but there was an element of optimizing also for the bigger fundraise, and we need more money, and then you need to scale even faster, and you actually need to grow into the valuation that you are having. And this was really tough. And super intense. So there was no Tulum sitting at the beach for me. I was literally either in a warehouse at the outskirts of Mexico City, or in our office, and the 7 days a week. It was a really tough journey, fun journey, but also very tough. And then we ended up exiting to Razor Group, which is an e-commerce aggregator in Germany that merged with us post Series B. So this was very lucky as well that this actually happened.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, an amazing journey, right? You've gone from jumping around like Taipei, trade shows, to running a business which had a humongous evaluation, and you were the real business operator within that sort of leadership team as well. So the audience wants to know, and I want to know, I assume this made you a very wealthy man. Like, what?
It didn't. I wish. No, I think it's, of course, you make some money along the way, but my number one advice for the audience is, do not pursue entrepreneurship if you do it for the money. And especially when they have a background in investment banking or private equity. I think the certainty of money that you can get in certain industries is just much higher than entrepreneurship. There's obviously, and then you get into this whole realm of, how does it work with dilution? How does it work with preferred equity? How much is your exit valuation? Thinking about an exit. How many companies are there in the world that you can actually exit to, with a given business after a certain valuation? So I think all of these different things come into play, and this is very, very important to keep in mind. And it's funny because, recently on LinkedIn, I see a lot of these LinkedIn influencers, and they always compare bootstrap versus venture-backed. And it's like, what's the better case? However, usually these comparisons are always made from an exit perspective, and it's always about what's the best exit for the founder. I believe that if you go down a venture-backed capital route for a business, there should be a very strong incentive to build something very, very big. Otherwise, it doesn't pay off on a pure financial basis. And I think that's okay if you really have this ambition. We have this ambition with Ameeba. For me, it's absolutely clear. I don't want to build this company without venture backing. But I think there's an element of really being clear of what is it that you want to achieve as an entrepreneur and what is the final outcome. And funding is then just the source of it.
This episode is sponsored by Opus. Opus brings entrepreneurs together to create opportunity through power of connection. Opus is a curated community for business builders who understand that relationships are the backbone of business and success. If you are an entrepreneur, founder, business builder, laser focused on a mission, Opus could be for you too. To find out more, go to joinopus.org. Now back to the show. So over half of business owners believe that their supply chain is needing significant improvement. Ameeba.
Yes.
What is it? Tell me.
So it's another funny thing, because it's really interesting, just taking a step back to my entrepreneurial journey with regards to Ameeba. This is my first software startup, and I was never excited about software up until building Ameeba. And the reason for that being is because I was a user of the tool that we're currently building in my former life. So I think the need for Ameeba was something that I'd have discovered over the past 10 years of my career. Now, what you have in supply chains is you have a lot of important data. data that is, regarding your purchase orders, your logistics, your production with different suppliers in China, whatnot. And a lot of this data is what we call unstructured. It's flying around in different emails, PDFs, Excel attachments, in a way structured in your different ERP systems. And Ameeba is sort of this layer of intelligence that sits on top of all of your existing channels and systems, pulls in this data to then generate insights on top of it. And it's funny because it's actually a very, from the outside, it's actually a very unsexy AI solution. It's not that we generate Ghibli images or, you can transform yourself and all these funny things that are happening. But it is, I think, one of these very tangible solutions where it's, pragmatically speaking, yes, you have data in Excel. Nobody knows how to leverage that data combined with all these other data sources. And we automatically bring these data sources together.
Amazing. So the keyword at the moment, or the keywords, or the acronym at the moment is AI.
Yes.
So 90% of business owners in a recent report said that they would like to introduce AI into their supply chain. How does Ameeba take on board AI and sort of introduce that into its product?
It's an interesting one as well, because there are two types of customers that approach me. And there's one type that I really love and the other type that I find very difficult to handle. The first type are customers that come to us with a problem that they have that we are actually solving. No matter whether we are using AI or not, but they have a problem, a really tangible problem regarding visibility of what's going on in their supply chain, and they really want to have our software solution to support them. The other type of customer are customers that come, they don't really know what we're doing, but they say, the board told me I should look into bringing AI into my supply chain. So, Mr. Hoffmann, how do we do that? It's like, well, let's talk about your problem first and see if our solution can actually solve your problem via artificial intelligence. So I think it's really coming from that angle. Again, for me, and this was one of the biggest learnings that I've had as well, we definitely rode this whole AI hype with Ameeba, but it was not intentional from a perspective that me and my co-founder sat down and said, let's build an AI startup. Actually, we started off that I came in from my industry experience and said, look, there's a very interesting problem that I would like to solve. And my co-founder and I were then brainstorming, how can you solve that problem? And AI just happened to be the solution to that problem. And it was just very, very serendipitous timing. So I think, oftentimes when we talk about AI, it is a buzzword, 100%. But let's actually more talk about what is the real problem that you're solving, and is AI capable of solving that? Because I think right now as well, there's a lot of excitement, but also a lot of smoke and mirrors regarding what is actually possible. And I mean, we see this firsthand actually. There's some things that seem simple that are extremely difficult to do, and we can do them, but it takes a lot of effort and really, really great talent to actually make these things possible.
Yeah, 100%. So you mentioned your co-founder there. Throughout your journey, you've had co-founders.
Yeah.
Semi-unusual, semi-not unusual, just from the amount of ventures you've been a part of at your age. But would you recommend co-founders? I think this is such an interesting topic. I've only ever done co-founders with my journey. I'm also on a journey where I've only ever been bootstrapped. So, however you look at sort of categorizing the sort of type of business that you're on, I personally have found having a co-founder invaluable to like how I position myself in my business. For you personally, co-founders?
I could never in the world would I want to be a solo founder. I could not do that. I could not do that journey as a solo founder. And I've been sort of a solo founder with my first business because Jack was not really there. He was not really involved. So I was managing it, and it was bootstrapped, right? It was like a real factory, and it was horrific. I think that there's I often say the third most important person in my life after my wife and my child is my co-founder. And it's really true. There's the emotional side of things where you have all these up and downs. But then there's also the other part of it, that there's not one other person in your company that will care as much about the company as your co-founder. Now, the one big learning that I've had with my previous business is I believe you can also have too many co-founders. So I think there's an ideal split where maybe it's, you and another person, or you or two other people. I think once you get to 3, 4, 5 people and these strange mix-up teams, I think then a lot of things can also go wrong, because suddenly you don't really have, a clear balance when it comes to who makes which decisions, because it's all about risk-taking. For me and my co-founder work quite well. I will say, though, and, for transparency, I've met my co-founder at Entrepreneurs First, which is an accelerator here in London. Finding the right co-founder is really, really difficult. And actually, one interesting thing for me is after exiting Valoreo, I literally spent close to not a year, but 8-9 months to just look for a co-founder. And I did so many different programs, Y Combinator co-founder search, On Deck, a program in the US, met extremely talented people, people that I'm still friends with as well. But none of them were just that exciting that I said, okay, I actually really see myself building a business with you. And I think the co-founder part is one where I see a lot of other founders easily compromise on, where at some point, especially if it's a non-tech person and then they meet an engineer that worked at Meta or something, it's like, good enough, like let's just do it together. But I really see it as significant as choosing your life partner, or something like that, where this decision actually really, really matters in the long term, more than actually the problem that you're solving, because you go through so many ups and downs together.
Unbelievable. And I completely agree. How did you manage to categorize or have a criteria for those co-founders? Because they were judging you were judging them. Sort of, it's easy to be fake. It's easy to not be maybe transparent with what you truly want, because you see an opportunity and someone sees Cedrik come in and goes, well, he's an exit founder. He's, probably going to build something else, which goes really well. I want to, sign up for that rocket ship. You're an appealing co-founder.
Yes.
But then, as you said, you spent 8-9 months. You were quite careful with who you end up choosing to go on this next journey with. Did you have a sort of list that you sort of went through?
I need to smile because, I went through that learning process by myself. I think that initially I was very much focused on the credentials that somebody brought in on paper. So when somebody had a PhD, machine learning from, UCL, I was like, wow, this must be the best technical person I can work with in the world. Now, not every PhD, from UCL in machine learning has this issue, but generally speaking, they might not also be the best people to actually build something, right? Like 0 to 1 and actually building something. So it took me some time to figure out, okay, how do I actually evaluate the technical skills as a non-tech person of a technical co-founder? It was very difficult, so I could only stick to paper credentials. So this was one thing that was very hard to assess. The other thing is it actually comes down to sort of a gut feeling of, okay, I mean, you see something in a person. There are some people that you meet and they're like truly inspiring. It's like where I also say, oh my God, I need to work with that person, which was the case with my co-founder, with Craig. And the third thing that was very, very important for me to evaluate, and what happened in, the whole time before I've met Craig, do we actually both have an equal commitment and excitement for the space that we're building in? So very often when I went into these calls at Y Combinator or On Deck, for me it was clear I'm going to build something in supply chains. But then while I was appealing as a co-founder to many of those folks, there often was also the question of like, why should I build something for you in supply chains? I said, no, this doesn't work. Like, it's going to be our company. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what to build. I don't have a clue. I know a lot of problems that exist, but it's not that, I'm going to be the vision guy that sits here and tells you what to build. Like, that's not a job, It's like, we need to figure this out together, and you need to be very excited about the space from some form of an angle, and then we can think about building something together. Craig was the first and only engineer that proactively approached me and said, hey, Cedrik, let's talk about supply chains. And it was mind-blowing to me because we had our first date, our first co-founder date in a cafe, I still remember. And we just chatted about supply chains for like 2 hours straight. And somehow I was leaned back and I was like, how can it be that this guy knows so much, about supply chains? He's never set foot in a warehouse. And it turns out that Craig wanted to start a supply chain startup on his own before meeting me. And he actually bought a book on supply chain management, like a textbook. And he read the entire textbook. And we were sitting there and just chatting. I was like, oh my God, he knows so much about that stuff from a theoretical angle, but he clearly had a lot of excitement. And then suddenly he jumped up and said, oh my God, I have to leave. I thought, did I do something wrong? It's like a date, right? It's like, oh my God, did I upset you? What's going on? And Craig was like, no, I have an exploration call scheduled with the fulfillment manager of Huel, the protein drink. And it's right now, so I have to leave. And then he went away. I was like, this guy's on fire. I need to work with him. And I think this proactivity and this passion and this excitement for the space was something that I haven't seen in many. And I think this is something to be very, very careful about for yourself as a founder, but also for a co-founder. I think you need to have a deep passion and obsession regarding the problem that you're solving. Otherwise, it's just going to be a super difficult uphill battle to build something about a space that you're not excited in. Yeah.
I love it.
Yes.
I love it. So breaking into the B2B market
Yeah.
with Ameeba, you suddenly are building a SaaS solution,
Yes.
which you'd never done before. You've raised a bit of money. You're now a couple years in?
We are 1 year and 8 months in, have fundraised close to $10 million US pre-seed and seed together.
Awesome.
So this went quite well as well.
So far, so good. But, you're going to be getting that feedback constantly from the buyer. How have you found really collaborating with potential customers, prospects, and also maybe the pushback you maybe weren't expecting in certain areas of B2B sales?
I think there are various different ways how you can go about building a B2B, startup, or tech solution. We've intentionally chosen the way of co-developments. So we have companies that we partner with right from the start. We said, we're going to build our tool alongside you. You still need to pay for it, but at a preferential rate, and we're going to build it together with you. And I'm 100% convinced that for the type of tool that we're building, this was absolutely the right decision to do. Now, it's an uphill battle to get to that moment that somebody says, let me spend time and potentially money for a hypothetical solution that these guys are building. However, if you can make it and if you can get excitement for what you're doing with those customers, it actually works out really, really well because you have this very close feedback loop and you work together with the customers. I think at the same time, you need to navigate that you don't become a consultancy for those customers. So you still build a generalizable enough solution. So that's why you need to keep looking for new customers. It was definitely a very, very uphill battle and still is to get to that point. But I think that when you have a deep knowledge about a problem and you've done enough exploration, you actually go into these conversations very informed and you can actually convince those customers. That actually worked for us quite well. And doing that. So I think there's not an easy route to go about, doing B2B sales. I think for the tool that we're building, I could not imagine me and Craig and our engineers locking ourselves away in a room, build for 4 years, and then come into the market and be like, surprise, here's Ameeba, and everyone wants it. I think we were very conscious of that risk. So there was always this element of build super, super fast, ship it, build together with customers, onboard them, ship it again. There's an iteration, desk signing with the customer. Craig was just coming back from Portugal. He spent the last 3 days at a garment manufacturer in Portugal who's one of our customers, literally sitting in the factory, observing how the people use our tool and how the buying department uses our tool. And this is then being, translated back and we iterate on the back of that.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, to be honest with you, if I like my confession about supply chain, is that I view it as something super traditional, offline, old school, picking up phones, slow, all of these things. How's the embracement of tech been? Because you're coming into this with the latest hot, SaaS that's going to hopefully change the face of the industry.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's been others as well that have changed the face of the supply chain. But have you noticed that there's been some pushback in just sort of acceptance of tech, or do you think the sort of introduction of AI over the past year and 2-3 years has actually benefited Ameeba's sort of origin story really well?
I think it's a really interesting question because on a theoretical level, supply chains are underpinned by physical goods. And now in a completely, if we on a meta level, physical goods should be able to be tracked, right? It's a physical thing. We're not talking about data bits. We're not talking about, sentiment from customers like CX tools or so. It's like there's an actual container in the world that contains a physical product that's being transported. And then thinking about it, that it's still so non-digitized as a sector, and supply chain is half of the economy is a supply chain, right? So we're talking about a big industry here. It's sort of crazy if you think about it from that end. I think at the same time, what has happened in our particular case of B2B software within supply chains is we had ERP systems that have been built primarily for financial workflows. And then over time, they have sort of bastardized the supply chain tooling on top of it. So a lot of the tooling that exists in the software has never really been built for the operator, her or himself. It was never built from that perspective. It was always like, we take this, accounting financial tool, and here you can also track your purchase orders and maybe a little bit of logistics. So that's why we end up with this like zombie tech stack that exists today, where people pull in data from the ERP into the Excel and from the emails into Excel, and they kind of try to piece it together somehow. And it's funny because every supply chain team that we talk to, there's this one person that is an absolute SQL whatever genius and pieces together these master Excels where they pull in all these different data points. And I think that this very unrobust infrastructure, tech infrastructure, worked for a very long time simply because supply chain somewhat worked. But once we got into COVID, and now we got into tariffs, and we go into this extreme, global, instability on a geopolitical level, it really means that these things start breaking, and these systems are not meant to serve these complex cases. And I think that's where we're now in this inflection point, at least that I see with customers, where an initial frustration has turned into, oh my God, we really actually need a solution here. And they're not just frustrated about it, but they actually cannot perform their business and operate the business as they need to. And this was what I experienced firsthand as a supply chain operator for the last 10 years. So, there was definitely an interesting angle there.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite incredible, isn't it? I mean, I can go online now and clone my face, clone my voice, and it can even jump on a call with you.
Yeah.
Whilst if I order a package online, I'll just get a notification at the sort of maybe the day before saying your parcel will be delivered tomorrow. Surely I can have real time, or anything like that, which is possible, and I'm sure that is available out there, but. Why is the largest postal delivery service in this country not giving me more exact times of when my very important parcel is going to be delivered?
And now you think about it, there's a factory in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, or in Taiwan that is producing something, right? And you now need to have visibility on who is stitching things together somewhere on the ground. And this was something again, where for me, building in a sort of legacy industry now, software for a legacy industry, I think it has been extremely critical that I spent that much time on the ground as an operator in this industry, because I literally had a factory in Taiwan, so I know exactly what's happening on the ground. And I think there's oftentimes this excitement by entrepreneurs that come in and say, let me revolutionize a legacy industry, but they've never actually spent time in these legacy industries. And I think that, for whoever's watching and says, actually, I'm very excited about this whole, legacy industry and revolutionizing it with AI or any other technology, spend some time in that, with the users in that industry. Spend a year, I don't know, working at a trucking company if that's what you want to revolutionize or so. Because I think getting that understanding of where things are coming from is insanely important in order to then develop the right solution.
Yeah, 100%. Spend the time doing it. It's funny actually, because when I started my career, I always sort of saw myself doing two routes, which is go into an industry.
Yeah.
Do whatever role that may be. It was marketing probably because that was my background. Go do that for 5 to 10 years and then start a business in that space.
Yeah.
Or, which is what I actually ended up doing, which is go join any startup and learn how to do a startup and find an industry that you can sort of work on. So I completely agree. Anyone who's going to go start the latest fintech from an operations background, it's probably going to struggle, potentially.
I've I have this frustration still with the startup community itself that, what I mentioned earlier, this whole idea of some people really believe they can build a company by being the vision guy. To me, this is mind-blowing, because that's not how building a business works. If you look at any kind of, company that has made it, and, think about Shopify with Tobias Lütke, if you think about Stripe with the Collins brothers, they all didn't start with the massive vision of revolutionizing payments or whatnot. They actually started solving a problem they've encountered themselves, whether it was with e-commerce checkouts or was the e-commerce store in the Shopify case. And from that onwards, they then grew a solution. So there was a very, very strong focus on let's solve a problem and let's see how many more problems can we solve with the same solution. And I think a lot of founders, they kind of take the reverse round. They go in and be like, okay, how can I build $1 billion+ company? And then they try to solve backwards and say, okay, now let me find a problem that serves this massive McKinsey report market opportunity. This is usually, in my experience, not how business is being built. Business is being built well, you solve a problem for 1 user, then for 2 users, then for 10 users, then for 100 users, and then you grow your business. And then you obviously develop a vision on top of that. But it's not just driven by the vision itself. It's actually embedded in a real problem that you're actually solving. And it's very tangible. And I think a lot of startups, even startups that fundraise a lot of money, they clearly lack that. And this to me is still very strange, because I think there's a celebration also by VCs when it comes to charisma and speaking about it, and being the Adam Newman of X, Y, and Z, and this is all very important for fundraising. But equally important it is to build an actual business. And to build an actual business means you need to solve a problem.
Absolutely. So supply chain, supply chain super well. Let's look into the future. What are Cedrik's sort of top trends that we're going to see happen in the space? Let's assume, talking to someone who knows very little about supply chain, maybe someone's listening and they might have a SaaS tool, but nothing to do with supply chain. It's a fintech, and they're very interested in what you have to say and your story. But they're learning about supply chain maybe for the first or second time. What are your sort of predictions over the next few years for us to watch out for how supply chain is going to be transformed?
From an operational standpoint, I think that the geopolitical environment that we are seeing means that there's going to be massive rearrangement and shift in how things are being produced. And it's like the number one evidence is if you think about, critical materials in the US right now, they cannot be sourced from China anymore. Even before the tariffs, we had this whole Huawei issue. So I think supply chains are the foundation to where a lot of things along, a trade war and these political things are happening. And thereby there's going to be a lot of movements, a lot of shifts. And we see it already where customers of ours and other customers think about, okay, how can we nearshore? How can we relocate production back to the UK? How can we bring production back to Europe? How can we, US companies, we see a trend where there's a lot of startups that are being funded that build these, new era of factories that can actually exist on the ground in the US. So I think there's going to be a massive shift in supply chains. Now, whether sourcing goes then from China to Vietnam and from Vietnam at some point, to Africa, I don't know yet. We don't know. But I can really see that this is going to be a massive, massive trend in a reshifting and realignment of supply chains over the next couple of years. What then happens on the data side or on the AI side or on the software side is basically how can you, accommodate that shift. And I think this then also extends into other industries. When you think about fintech, when you think about, folks that think about robotics and all of that, I think there's going to be the change that is happening within supply chains in general, which is massive, is quite vast, given the geopolitical environment that we're in.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating sort of situation, especially for current day. I think this podcast will go out in probably 6 to 8 weeks' time, but I imagine that will still be very, very popular when we get to that point. So in your experience, if a business is looking to either onshore or nearshore their supply chain and their operations, can Ameeba help with that, that issue, that challenge, and maybe some, I don't want to say top tips, but what are your sort of things to watch out for if a business owner is looking to do that?
I think from an Ameeba angle, let's say, it definitely helps that you will have different suppliers. They interact with you in different ways, and you again have a lot of more data that you need to stay on top of and that you need to manage. So I think from that angle, Ameeba can definitely help that you can actually manage more suppliers with the same headcount because you're being supported by our technology and by the software. I think when it comes to top tips to the person that actually wants to nearshore and reshore and think about that, from my operator background, I think there's a very, very interesting thing of how do we think about costing. And costing means that for a very, very long time, supply chains have been operated from a perspective of let's look at the cheapest cost at which we can buy a product, but not incorporating the cost of transport, the cost of logistics, not incorporating the lead time. So how long does it take to not just produce the good, but also get the goods from China to Europe, and not incorporating then other factors such as quality or even IP and intellectual property. And I think that there's a big element and a big disconnect between, as a company, where do you set your metrics? Do you just focus on, let me buy goods at the lowest possible cost, like when I buy it from the factory? Or do you also factor in all these additional items, which then might mean, in comparison, sourcing something from Turkey or Portugal might be as cost efficient, if not even more cost efficient than from China, if you factor in these different costs and the lead time and the responsiveness to the market and all of that. And I think this just requires a much deeper thinking around your sourcing strategy and your supply chain strategy than what is happening right now or has happened historically in the market. So it's very easy to say, okay, let me just find this product, but then the cheapest possible. Okay, but then you still need to manage all these other cost items around it, your storage cost, your fulfillment cost, all of that. So I think there's a big element of actually being very mindful of these different things and thinking about your sourcing very, very strategically. And this applies to a large company as much as to a small, medium-sized D2C, e-commerce brand that might never have put in that amount of thought into it.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, obviously, I come at everything from a marketing sort of mindset and headspace, and I was actually speaking to a co-founder of a business in the B2C, D2C arena, fashion brand. I've not touched that world in a few years, but I still like to have those conversations. And they were basically using their supply chain, their location of origin as a marketing plan. And I think we're going to see that more and more. I know that if I look at the shoes that I'm wearing, that they're from Portugal. Portuguese leather is very well known for being high quality, rather than it's made in Vietnam. Ironically, when I visited Vietnam, I did pick up some
nice,
some leather.
Yeah.
So I think a leather coat from there. But I literally went to the source of origin.
Yes.
But I think, for, let's say, the UK domestic market, people do look at where that shoe is made or where that, toy is made or wherever that looks like. And I think it's not just a business owner looking at that unit cost of something and going, okay, yes, it's like twice the price than if I produce it from China. Oh, but then, Cedrik, economies of scale and everything else.
Yeah.
But actually, if you take all that data, I think, as you say, many business owners might be very surprised at what the actual result is.
And also from a marketing perspective, I think, one of the biggest shocks, our core focus right now is the fashion textiles industry. And the biggest disruption that has happened very recently is Shein. You have Shein and Temu. And it's absolutely nuts, actually, what has happened. Because, suddenly there's a company that churns out 8,000 new products every single year on a constant basis. You cannot compete with that. And some of these products might actually come from the same factories that you were sourcing from. So then rethinking your entire supply chain as part also of your branding and of your operational basis and how do you sell to customers, I think is extremely important to still gain a USP in a market where we have players such as Shein really flooding the market with cheap goods. And this is really the disruption that is happening, especially in retail and fashion, which I find so exciting because, again, I see us providing a solution in that case, but also because it's such a massive change that is going on to the extent where some of the fashion brands that we see today that are flourishing, we will not see them in a couple of years' time, inevitably, because of how big this change in the market currently is.
So interesting. And I guess any business owner that might be listening to this who, they are on that journey, might be 1 or 2 years or even less, just starting out in an arena that has a very high importance of supply chain. Like my business, I'm running a marketing agency. We don't need supply chain. It's not of massive importance to us. But there are so many businesses out there where it's so critical, it's project critical. And I think taking this advice into consideration is really important because, even if they're super knowledgeable about their space, they may not have that skills in supply chain.
It's exactly what I said, what happened with me and my previous co-founders. If you build up a company that sells a physical good, the backbone of your business is your supply chain. And I think it's this unsexy thing that also a lot of founders that start something with a physical good, they don't really want to wrap their head around. It's like, okay, let me Google, how difficult can it be? Let me go to Alibaba and find a supplier. And they don't want to become experts in one of those things that is so critical. But then if you think about it, there's not a surprise why Tim Cook actually, became, the key man behind Apple after Steve Jobs, and he was running and building up Apple's supply chain. Why, Jeff Bezos, and you think about Amazon is a supply chain company, if you think about Fulfilled by Amazon. And these are all these elements where you suddenly realize, oh my God, this is actually really foundational and fundamental to the business that you're building. And maybe you should not just treat it as this, necessary evil that just needs to be managed, but something where you as a founder also want to be somewhat knowledgeable about, or then really get the right resources into your team to say, okay, this is actually a real edge that I can have.
Awesome. So with all of this, Ameeba, your past businesses, your journey over the last 10 plus years, you had a child right at the start of when you were starting Ameeba. was the reaction from your peers in the space of sort of entrepreneurial founder land, where when you sort of taking on two new babies at the same time?
I appreciate the question a lot, because I think there's definitely a lot more that we can do on the culture side in the startup community. I was very scared to tell people that I have a child. I was very scared to tell people, a newborn child, to tell investors when I was raising the pre-seed round, because I was worried that I'm going to be judged as, is he going to give it his all? You know, he has a family and all of that. Now, think about it from my perspective. I didn't carry the child. My wife carried the child. I don't want to know how it is if you're a woman that is actually a female founder, you know, that is having a child or wants to have a child. The pressure must be immense, because I was very scared about talking about it. And I think by now I talk about it very openly, but there's still this hint, you know, when I talk to candidates in an interview or so, might they then think that I'm not committed enough as a founder because I also have family commitments? And it's very sad that I have this fear, but I think it's a fear that is really existent within the startup community. I think at the same time, I must say, you know, the support that I've gained when I spoke about it was immense, both from our investors, most importantly, my co-founder. So I think, again, it's so important that you work with the right people that actually support you at the stage of life what you're at. But at the same time, which is also true, I'm definitely not, you know, a superstar dad, you know, not because I don't want to, but because I don't have the time. I think there is a real sacrifice that you need to make. I'm very willing to make that sacrifice, very intentionally. My wife is extremely supportive, so I'm very grateful for that. But also, you cannot have it all. You cannot build a company and do this fantastically and be a great dad and do the. You need to make certain choices, and you know, I'm knock on wood that I will not regret those choices. But I think for me this is clear. Yeah.
Which one has been giving you more sleepless nights in the last year?
Yeah, definitely Ameeba. Yeah, it's like, I mean, sometimes I'm at this point, you know, I'm getting so confused. I call my son Vincent Ameeba, you know, it's like Ameeba, no, Vincent. No, it's definitely Ameeba, but I think it's more, you know, the way that I treat Ameeba, it is literally like a child. And I treat my team as people that depend on me and that I'm responsible for. So, you know, there are a lot of more people that I need to be responsible for. Again, this burden is shared with my co-founder, whereas the family burden is shared with my wife, fortunately. Ameeba has definitely given me more sleepless nights. Yeah.
Amazing. And over the last sort of 10 plus years of being an entrepreneur and a successful entrepreneur as well, and you've still got so much more to give the community, which I love. You know, you've had some tough times during that, you know, where you've had to pick yourself off the floor. Can you like pinpoint a moment where you really did hit that floor and have to pick yourself up to, you know, go again and be here today?
I think one of the moments that I appreciate the most, but which was really one of the most difficult times, was when my first company failed during COVID. It was really, really, really tough. And it's like, I like to mention that you know, you have like these inspirational, you know, Instagram, you know, accounts for founders, and it's like Muhammad Ali standing there, you know, it's like, no matter how often you get beaten, and matters that you get up again, all of that. We can talk about all of this resilience and all of that, but in reality, to go through it, it's extremely tough. And, you know, I would lie if I wouldn't have, you know, thought in that moment, oh shit, did I actually make the wrong decision of going out being a founder, and kind of questioning myself when things got really, really tough. And of course I managed through that, but I think it's moments like these that are very, very difficult. And I think seeing your business fail is actually extremely difficult. And on the flip side, I think the only way how you build resilience is actually going through that process and going through it again and going through it again. And I think it's actually these moments that make a real founder versus somebody who wants to try it and then says, okay, let me go back now, and you know, I've tried it, you know, kind of treat it like a gap year or something like this. I think in that moment when my first business failed during COVID, again, was this external event suddenly happened, everything sort of collapses in front of your eyes. Again, my life partner, my wife, was really, really important to me and super supportive of that. And I think at the same time, again, you can come out of this challenge being defeated, or you say, okay, you know what, I learned a lot of things. There's a sunk cost to it. Now scrapping all that learnings and just going back to a normal job is not an option. You know, and even now, even more now I need to win. And then you do the next thing. And then, you know, we had Valoreo. And again, it was not a superstar exit. But even, now I licked blood. It's like, okay, so this is how venture funding works. Okay, I learned it. I've been in board meetings. I learned how to interact with investors. I want to leverage that. And then it's sort of like, the nice thing about entrepreneurship is it's the one career where failing is actually rewarded. And not just on paper, but also for yourself, because there's an actual learning, which is counterintuitive to how traditional careers work. But only if you take the failing as a learning and you learn from it, and then you learn from it again, and you keep going and you keep going, and you find your way around it.
Awesome. So during that sort of period of time, right the way back to when you were employed by someone else, your career so far, do you have it as more important that you've been lucky or that you have talent?
You mean as an entrepreneur?
As an entrepreneur.
I think neither. I think it's just grit. Yeah, honestly, I think I come from I genuinely believe that any person can learn anything if they want to, and it all comes down to putting in the work and putting in the hours and being super gritty and super motivated. I think there was just always a lot of grit and a lot of hustle and a lot of, just doing it and not being ashamed. The moment when I was walking around at the trade show, I was very ashamed. People look at me, who's that guy? Like this dodgy guy pulls out his business cards. But you just jump over it and you do it again and you do it again. And I think this is really, really, really critical. And I think I've just always had a lot of grit. And by being very gritty, you then create your own luck. And of course, I was very lucky that I've met Jack. And I was very lucky that my friends from banking called me and said, hey, let's do Valoreo. And I was very lucky, that I've met Craig, my co-founder. But then from a different perspective, well, I could only have met Jack if I went to Taiwan and went to these different trade shows. And I could have only, got lucky with Valoreo if I took the jump, instantly packing my bags and moving to Mexico with, 4 guys that I didn't really know, actually, and they picked me up from the airport in Mexico City. It's like, let's build Valoreo. So I think you need to create your own luck. And in order to create your own luck, it's not so much about talent, but number one, it's about grittiness. And of course, raw intelligence helps, and this is important as well. But I think that at the end of the day, it's all about the hustle and the grit and working really hard and creating opportunities and not being afraid. I think that's something, that's very, very important.
Amazing. Great answer. And Cedrik, where can people find you if they want to get in touch after this?
Yeah, please on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn tagline or, URL is Cedrik Hoffmann, Cedrik with K and Hoffmann H-F and N. So Cedrik Hoffmann, please look me up, and that's the primary spot, basically.
Amazing. Everything happens on LinkedIn.
Everything happens. I have a private Instagram account, and my friends always tell me, please do not make it public, because there's a lot of gym pics and a lot of things that it's my separate life besides Ameeba.
Keep the private life there. Find you on LinkedIn, Cedrik Hoffmann or Cedrik Hoffmann Ameeba. They'll find you. Cedrik, thank you so much. You have been my everyday founder.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.